There we go.
It's Mercury retrograde. That's my excuse for everything. Okay. According to my computer, we are streaming live as I'm blaming Mercury retrograde on our problems. Um, so thank you for joining us. We this is the second attempt at bringing you our live debriefing by streaming from Zoom into Facebook, and hopefully we won't get cut off. We know that the last transmission just got cut off after we had a difficult start. So welcome. We're going to be debriefing the second episode of the Seven Sisters podcast, Not Quite Magic, reminding everyone that this season the theme is remote interpreting, and the second episode was an interview with Vanessa Costa, and we talked about healthcare interpreting and her role and amazing work as Director of Multicultural Affairs and Patient Services at Cambridge Health Alliance, which is a very large healthcare system with multiple facilities here on the East Coast in Metro Boston. And I talked a lot with her about this model that's very specific to Cambridge Health Alliance and to New England, it seems. At least it started here, which is using staff interpreters as the remote interpreters. So, in other words, not using a company or vendors to do over the phone interpreting or video remote interpreting, but actually having your own interpreters who used to work face to face or who sometimes work part-time face-to-face and part-time remotely, having them work for you in a hub that you build and then share across other facilities through a network called HCIN. But I did a lot of talking in the podcast, so I'm going to now, in what we've been doing in these debriefings is to talk with my wonderful business partners, Liz and Laura, my partners in crime at Seven Sisters, about their impressions of the episode and what issues came to the forefront for them when they heard the interview. And we are monitoring the chat in Facebook. So send us your questions, your comments, and we'll talk about those as well. And we want this to be as interactive and dynamic as possible. So, Laura, do you wanna start?
Sure. I think the first thing that strikes me from this really wonderful interview is what an amazing spokesperson Vanessa is for the field. And I think part of that comes from knowing her numbers, right? The breakdown of languages, a bunch of other statistics that are really important for getting outside of our interpreter silo. It's all well and good for us to say interpreting is important, interpreting is important. And I know other people in the field who understand, such as Catherine Allen and Barry Slaughter Olson, who commissioned the study a good while ago, that they understood the power of data and what it can do to make a difference in the people that we serve and in our working conditions. So just a note on that, in that I hope that we all as a field continue to work in that vein. And the other thing that struck me from the beginning of the podcast episode is when Vanessa talked about her journey to becoming a healthcare interpreter. It wasn't like, oh, I knew 2 languages and I knocked on a hospital door and then they said, sure. I think sometimes other interpreters who work in different fields might get the idea that that's how it works in healthcare. And certainly there's a huge demand for healthcare interpreters in the United States and Canada and other countries as well. But, you know, she did a 14-month program and then she did a gap year in Mozambique, right? And then she came back and was able to, you know, on I think she might have said a part-time basis or something like that, begin with tentative steps her career as a healthcare interpreter. And so that just and now she's the head of like a formidable, very forward-thinking department. And so that just reminds me of what amazing, we work with such amazing professionals who are thirsty for options and access to learning experiences that can help them do their job even better.
Yeah, that was a really good part of that experience, because I certainly was someone who did knock on hospital doors. Actually, it was 2003. So I was sending emails, and I got a letter in the mail from a hospital. Or maybe I sent a letter actually, but I didn't knock on the door, but I did kind of the equivalent at what was the equivalent at the time. And one of the hospitals actually was great and sent me a letter back with a brochure of one of the interpreting agencies. And they said, we don't hire interpreters, but these people do. And we have their interpreters come to us. And started that way. And I was part of I had been accepted into a master's program in translation studies, and I had worked as a translator with a sworn translator in Brazil for almost 3 years, but I didn't have training in interpreting. And so she exemplifies a group, an even more select group, because I think nowadays it's a little different, especially in Massachusetts. I don't think anybody would give you anything if you didn't have some kind of training. But back then she was part of a really small group of people that were seeking out training so early in their career, right off the bat before doing anything. And that's really great. And she and I have been connected throughout, in the different stages of her career, because she did really great work with CCCS in Woburn, Massachusetts, which is the one that in Massachusetts I always have to clarify for our Massachusetts audience, because the name is virtually the same as the one in Maryland.
I had that question as I was listening to. Yes.
Yep. And they do similar things. They have the one in Woburn also has textbooks. They have trainings. They have great materials, and they hire interpreters, which I think is a difference. Marjorie does not do that. The one in Maryland, but anyway. Yeah, that's a really good point, because how people get started has really changed. And yet, Vanessa exemplifies someone doing it really well from the beginning. So she,
Yeah, and I wanted to jump back into where I was talking about her being an amazing spokesperson and the power of data and knowing your numbers. Yes, yes, yes. But the other is the power of just polished presentation to non-interpreters about what we do, and getting a lot of the work that we're doing at Seven Sister, or really at String and Can right now with direct clients, is buy-in and education. And when I can tell she said it to a lot of providers, like, look, in orientation, we're going to talk to you about language services on day 1 of your job, because on day 2 you'll be working with an interpreter. And I think we could, in the larger field, adapt that to say, yeah, we have to think about this on day 1, because on day 2 you're going to be working in a multicultural environment. You're already and that has a lot to do also with a recognition of for example, what's happening in the United States right now. That I think it's a coming of age. It's a moment in which we're taking a look around. Well, some of us were already looking around, but certain groups in the United States are looking around and seeing the reality of the vast and beautiful differences between or variety of cultures and groups and languages and whatnot that we work with.
Yeah, and I'll because I think we decided on this, right? So I'll plug the theme that we have for the next season of the podcast. So I know it's just beginning. We have 2 episodes out. I have several interviews that have been recorded. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, we're getting close to thinking about the next season. And and after talking about this interview and other things that are going on in this moment in our country and in the world, we decided on having the theme as being power for the next season. And so you mentioned power, and I said, you know what, this is a good time to let our listeners know that that'll be what we'll be working with and focusing on as a theme for the next season of Not Quite Magic, which again, this is nowhere close to you, but it's close to me because pretty soon I probably will start interviewing people for that one. And looking at power in our field in all of its forms, you know, who has it, who doesn't, what are the dynamics? This is something that in interpreting studies and communication studies, people talk about a lot. Academics talk about it a lot, but it can be quite relevant and really interesting to look at. And then also looking at power just in the field, you know, who is seen as an expert, who is out there as a spokesperson, and does it represent who we truly are as a group? And I think, you know, the power along with diversity will be what I'll be talking to people about as I, you know, do the profile interviews with them.
This might be as good of a time as any to talk a little bit about what Vanessa couched as a navigator role. And Vanessa might be aware or might not be aware of kind of how controversial it is to even think about an interpreter interjecting and saying, like, "Hey, do you know if this patient's health insurance covers that medicine at that pharmacy," sort of thing. And I like the way Vanessa talks about it as helping identify barriers that would otherwise be invisible. And so I don't want to go too into the weeds regarding advocacy and navigator role and differences between Canada and the United States and the rest of it. But what occurs to me is what came a little bit later in the podcast, which is a flip example. So I think some people might hear that and say, you know, we're just there to interpret, and an English-speaking patient might not have someone there at their side to interject and make sure that their health insurance is covering their medicine, et cetera, et cetera. But contrast that with what came a little bit later in the podcast, which was when they were working with the transition to remote interpreting, and what I believe the director of the hospital, of the emergency department, had identified. You know, the aim was to get a 5-minute triage to treatment. I guess it was someone correct me if I'm wrong. And they were able to get that for English-speaking individuals. Non-language marginalized individuals. But for language marginalized LEP individuals, the wait time was much longer. So where's the person, you know, so it's like, it's too simplistic in my mind to say, you know, an English-speaking person wouldn't have the benefit of someone advocating for them, because there's such a long list of disadvantages on the other side that it misses the gray. And I think that's what hopefully we'll be interested in delving into and hearing from voices we don't often hear from in the next season of the podcast. Liz, you probably have some opinions about this, what has hitherto been called the advocate role as it was developed. And Elena, we talked about this a little bit before, Vanessa mentioned she was trained by the best of the best. And these were pioneers who were putting together frameworks for us to try to better our craft and our service and for us to work within. But we were thinking this morning, and I'm realizing as in my training work, my expectation is when I work with students, not that they will take that as the gospel and, you know, live within that framework and operate within the framework for the rest of their careers. My expectation, and maybe if any of them are here, or maybe we'll say it next time we work with them, but that they would take that as a useful tool, a useful model, work within it while constantly rethinking How do we need to do this differently? How can we do this differently? What other voices can I hear and listen to that will allow me to figure out how this needs to be tinkered with? While still, yes, operating under professional standards, but always looking to see where those standards and those protocols and those frameworks can be expanded and tinkered with and morphed.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Laura. I agree that advocate role has, well, maybe the advocate role, how has it changed? I don't know, but I think our understanding of it has changed. How we define it, how we talk about it has changed. And yet, in my experience as an interpreter and a trainer of interpreters, the way that we approach it in training has not necessarily changed. And that's kind of what I hear from you. And the when I listen to the interview and listen to Vanessa talking about specifically why healthcare providers within her system prefer working with staff interpreters, whether they're on site or remote, uh, she is talking exactly about interpreters acting as advocates for the patients because they have that knowledge of specific barriers that may exist within that specific system. They're able to fill in the blanks, and as she said, these are positive things that come out of advocacy, right? It leads to compliance. It's positive for this, for the system as a whole, leads to patient engagement and generally better outcomes for the patient, which kind of flies in the face of the thinking, this black and white thinking of, we must only act in this very specific, neutral, impartial way, which I think when we're training interpreters in the very beginning, and when you're learning anything in the beginning, right, it's normal and okay to introduce it in this very black and white structured way. But in my experience as an interpreter and an interpreter trainer, we don't have a lot of opportunities to, once we finish this kind of basic training, we don't have a lot of opportunities to move outside of that kind of black and white model comfortably. And so that was something that that also really got me thinking, where Vanessa speaks about advocacy in such a natural way. It's not a controversy here, right? It's, of course, the interpreters step outside of that. If we want to still think about the conduit model, of course they do that, and it leads to better outcomes.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Liz, as you said that, what occurs to me, you were talking about systemic barriers, and that there are several ways that we could go as trainers to start parsing this out and maybe presenting more helpful language or models around this function. And what occurs to me is that, at least in kind of some of the specific examples that have been mentioned or that you were probably referring to, Liz, is that really we could think of being system advocates for a better system, for a more equitable system. And that might steer us in the right direction, as opposed to getting so hung up on being advocates for a specific patient at the individual level. The other direction that we could go with this, that I think Vanessa presents very, and she's added some really wonderful comments here in the Facebook chat, but that she hints at in all of the well-presented information that she shares, which is, especially with staff interpreters, you have this professional code of ethics, these frameworks and the protocol, and those are very useful for making decisions as an interpreter. But you are also an employee of an institution, and I know sometimes those might feel like they are at odds with each other. But I think thinking about those being, the same way we are simultaneously sisters and children and mothers and fathers, we have the sophistication to engage with multiple roles. And it's the same with a physical therapist and a doctor. They have their codes of ethics and their, kind of hopefully helpful protocols for doing better in their professions and in their arts. But then they are also employees of an institution that they want to see go well, which means, if someone's lost in a hospital and they ask me a question, I say, well, I'm just an interpreter. No, I'm a human. And someone has asked me for directions. I'm also a member I'm an employee of a certain institution. And so I say, yes, let me help you get to cardiology. And so I don't think, whereas, yes, it isn't important to understand our limitations, it's also important for doctors and nurses. Everyone is grappling with the same thing, to understand their limitations, but where they also have other roles that they're engaging in fluidly and simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like how you put that. And it reminded me of something that came up recently in one of my workshops. I did this workshop on, boundaries, role boundaries, and impartiality, and we're soon going to be offering that for Seven Sisters as well. And one of the attendees was talking about, this choice between being a human and keeping her job. And it really, it doesn't have to be separate. And I think there's a couple of things that I could say about what we've been discussing. One of them is the idea that, yes, all profession have code of ethics, and everyone is grappling with that, and how close you get, how connected can you be on a personal level, for example, with people that you work with. And yet, as I'm thinking about this, it occurred to me again that, communication and is so complex, right? And it's so wrapped up with how we see the other and our relationship with the other and our connection with the other. And I think that that's one of the reasons behind our insistence in having very clear role boundaries between interpreters and patients and providers, because it is harder to do our job well if we're very connected to that person. And so if we're engaging a lot in personal relationships with them, it actually does affect our job a little bit differently, I would think, than a nurse who might engage, personally with a patient. That was just off the top of my head, kind of thinking about, again, that reinforcing why they're there. And I think it's really thinking about how we train to them, how we speak to interpreters and students about them. And I love this idea of being system advocates and not doing advocacy or helping a specific patient. And that, we've been talking about this for a long time, because if you help one patient, you're not going to change the system. You're going to give that person help, but then the next 10 people that come down the line and that either don't have an interpreter because they don't need one, or they have a different interpreter, they're not going to get that help. And then the system isn't going to get changed because nobody's going to realize it. And the last thing too is that this idea that, navigating, being a navigator is a separate thing, as if the message were only, we're only there to deliver the message, right? The message has everything to do with the context, right? And so language marginalized patients don't have the same context. There are navigators for English speakers in a system in the United States. Depending on the hospital system, they're patient navigators. It's a emerging profession. And this is adding to this. It makes sense to pair it up with interpreters who understand the nuances of being a patient navigator for someone who comes from a totally different context. But I think even having that patient navigator as something that hospitals employ, they're acknowledging how fragmented and how complex and difficult to handle the healthcare system has become. you need somebody to navigate you through it, metaphorically, but even literally, as with somebody needing to find cardiology. It's, so then yes, as we all know, like, what do you do when somebody's it doesn't have that context? They're not exposed to the television shows about it. They're not exposed to the radio, to neighbors, to everyone talking about what's going on in healthcare nearly as much, because they're not fully immersed in the culture because of that, the marginalization of the language. So thank you. I love that. I like the idea of thinking about as system advocates.
Yeah, I was taking notes as you were talking, Elena, and it's so striking to me to hear, and I've heard this myself, to hear that interpreter trainees and even working interpreters talk about feeling like they have to make a decision between being human and keeping their job. And I feel like that's a red flag for us as trainers. Like, we might be approaching this, we might need to change our approach in this, but that I can understand that that's how it feels. That's how it feels when you're trained in this very black and white way of do this, don't do that. And you're never really given the opportunity to grow outside of that framework. And you're never, when I was managing staff of interpreters, what I learned was that I and nobody had ever taught them how to have a conversation about our work. So yeah, that making a choice between being human and keeping your job, it's like, oh, we need to change our approach when we talk to interpreters about our work, when we train them, because we still get to be human, right? And we still get to we still get to hold our values and our beliefs, but we have to be aware of how that may affect our work, right?
Yeah, I know that was a one of those difficult moments as a trainer to have someone say that, and then I'm like, okay, how can I navigate this? And because of course we're humans. It's not about now we're entering robot mode or something. But you're right. I think it has to do with an understanding that it's all about the limits and what I cannot do. And I was trying to talk about knowing yourself more, because if you know yourself and your own limitations and you understand where you fit in and where your profession fits in, as a whole, then it's not about, oh, there are all these things I cannot do. It's more, how is the system going to work? And that really good example that's in Marjorie Bancroft's textbook about the international community interpreter, of the when she and the authors of the chapter are talking about autonomy and the bus driver, and someone wants to get on the bus, and they ask the bus driver, I'm kind of perhaps coloring the example a little bit differently, but the idea that a bus driver has a certain route to follow and a schedule to follow. And if somebody needs the bus driver to stop at a different place today because they're having a really awful problem and the bus driver wants to help, and it would be helpful to that person for the bus driver to stop somewhere else. But then the whole system gets thrown off. Everybody else relying on the bus to go a certain way and to stop at a certain time is going to have everything upended. And then
So that goes back to the systemic, right? But if if the bus route is bunk, like, it might not be worth like protecting protecting
Yes.
a kind of a bunk, like a route that doesn't work.
Well, and I think, and then I'll let you speak. I think the one time when I presented that example, the expansion of that is like, if you in fact if you're helping that one person here and there, or some of the bus drivers are helping people here and there. Let's say there's a big housing development or a whole neighborhood that's being neglected. There's really no buses that go by there, and the individual bus drivers are helping them out by taking them a little bit closer. No one is going to say, at a system level, hey, we need to get a bus route that goes through this neighborhood, that goes by this housing project, that goes by whatever. because yeah, you need to change the system, but if you're helping kind of, as one or both of you said, at like a specific patient to be helpful, you're actually not potentially as helpful as if you bring it up, outside of the encounter and say, look, there's a lot of people coming to me who have to walk 10 minutes to get to the bus. Why aren't we going through that neighborhood? And then, with the optimism that I always have, they'll change the bus route.
Right. And you as the interpreter might be the only one in that particular moment to actually be able to identify and speak up about that.
Exactly.
Speak about that. I mean, yeah, it doesn't always have to seem as, as radical activist as maybe some of the examples might paint it to be. And I think Vanessa gives very just run of the mill things that we have to think about how they fit into our into the way that we practice our profession. And Elena, to tie that back up, you were talking about how other professionals often have to grapple with this, and it occurred to me that and that it could be different for other providers than it is for us as interpreters, because we're doing something so intimate, is kind of the way you put it. And it occurred to me that really we might, as a field, maybe we could have someone on the podcast look to therapists who I feel like have to really figure out where that line is, and probably a much more nuanced way than even we have to look at it. And then we could also pull in, of course, colleagues from signed language fields who tend to have a slightly different approach that's more social justice canned, and at least they have been thinking in the social justice terms, and have developed kind of approaches and lines of inquiry and thought around their role in their work. And finally, because I know we need to pivot to the implementation of remote, right?
Right. Yes.
But I think it feels timely and important to say that as we think about our role as interpreters, and it just with what's going on, particularly in the United States right now, what has been going on in the United States, but what is in conversation in the United States right now, it feels so outdated to try to say something as simplistic as, let's just try to make sure that, LEP patients have the same access as English speakers. Because if they were coming on, if everyone in society was coming to the table on equal footing, then that might be a legitimate approach. But this sort of let's try to treat everyone the same is what we have been doing in the United States at a societal level and at an institutional level, that completely dismisses the fact that people aren't treated the same. They haven't been treated the same, and for a very long time. And so I think it's time for our field to cop to the game and think about what that means in the context of our work, because we're not just talking about language marginalization. If someone is marginalized in linguistic terms, it's likely that they are also, intersectional discrimination. It's likely that they are marginalized in other ways as well. So I'll hand it back to you to take us to share your thoughts and take us into remote world.
Thank you. It's interesting. This happened last time too, where we have the season's all about remote, and so many interesting issues come up, and then we leave remote interpreting for the very end of our debriefing. But it ties into it, because a lot of what Vanessa was talking about, and why we started talking about navigation and the vital role that an interpreter can have, was because the interpreters that she employs are doing it remotely, and so they're in a different modality than I would say probably most interpreters, maybe not number wise, but it's not what we think of, right? We don't think of remote interpreters as kind of the main way. We think of having in-person interpreters. And by not being dependent on vendor interpreters, as she called them, interpreters that are working for an agency, that are working for an outside company and are coming in via phone or video, but actually using her staff members, then they can add that extra, they can better serve that extra role. They can have a place to do the advocacy, to do the navigation, because they know the local, at a local level, what the patients are going through, what the difficulties might be, the context. They know the context, and it again talks about how language and marginalization is not something that happens in a vacuum. It's all about context. That's why it is marginalized, because you're not living in a full, it's just a very different life. Either in some cases there's a very vibrant, strong community that speaks in the language that you speak, and in other cases there's not. But in both ways, it's it's a very different experience than someone that doesn't have that other language and that other background. So yeah, so why don't do you, Liz, wanna start saying something about specifically about remote interpreting, since that is our focus, and kind of what the interview brought up for you in that regard?
Yeah, definitely. I think that what really stood out for me was the way that Vanessa talked about her work. It's very, very, very clear that to implement remote interpreter services, I mean, it's a multi-piece thing, right? But you need buy-in from leadership for sure. And incidentally, in my experience, one of the ways you get buy-in is by knowing how to speak to them. And I think Vanessa is a great model for how we talk about the work. But it just reminded me again how much healthcare and healthcare interpreting is a relationship. It functions on relationships. I mean, everything functions on relationships, which may have gotten difficult these last few months as we're no longer seeing each other physically face to face. But when she talks about just the importance of working with the staff interpreters, even though they're remote, because hospital staff know them. And just the general sense that I got from all the work she's been able to accomplish and that her staff have been able to accomplish, it just reminded me of, again, how important that relationship building is. When I was working in the hospital setting, I had a very, very different experience implementing remote interpreter services from what Vanessa described. And really, we only began to see a shift towards providers providers not outright rejecting remote interpreter services when we were going one-on-one, meeting them, talking to them, what were the barriers in terms of using remote interpreter services. And so that was something that really, really stood out for me, was just how important engaging not only the healthcare staff and the patient population. It's amazing this work they've done on this front, but also considering the interpreter's experience in remote interpreting. So I, at the kind of near the end of the interview, that's where Vanessa's shift kind of focused to, well, what was the experience like for the interpreters, and what does it continue to be like? How does it continue to evolve? And considering all of those pieces, I mean, it's just almost exhausting to think about, but still it gives you hope to know that just with this kind of relationship building and considering all of these pieces, this kind of thoughtful consideration can really lead to a robust, successful program that includes remote interpreting as a big, big piece of it.
So I'm going to jump in because this hits on that like positive funny bone spot That's a way to talk about it. Of what can the different settings learn from each other. And so, for example, it makes me, Liz, you had pointed to this earlier when we were talking. It makes me think of the shift that conference interpreters are going through right as we speak, I would say, to a large extent, towards what remote services are going to look like alongside existing services. And conference interpreters are, as a whole, the field, they're wonderful advocates for working conditions. And so this is what healthcare interpreters can probably stand to learn from conference interpreters and to use that. And on the flip side, conference interpreters could learn from healthcare interpreting the focus that's put on serving the patient, serving the provider, the kind of decentralized focus, I think could be helpful in conference interpreting to help balance out that the fight for adequate working conditions. To also alongside that say, how can remote interpreting better serve our clients and the people who use our services? What can be gained? And even to a certain extent, just learn from the transition that what in this example, we're talking about back in 2012. And what does Vanessa explicitly state? It was really hard at the beginning. But nothing is forever, right? It is not that hard currently. And so I'll stop there.
Yeah, and it was really difficult, and yet I think she had probably one of the best experiences transitioning during the pandemic. So she went through all that. The department went through all those difficult changes and got there. And so that then when COVID-19 arrived, they were just in such a good place. Because what did she say? It's like 72 hours or something, and they were ready to go with all the interpreters from home at the same level of quality as they had been used to. And it's, it really is forward thinking. It's not just saying, oh, we have to do this, we have to capitulate and go the way that seemed necessary. What is it? Not necessary evil. Yeah, necessary evil. But rather, what are some positive points? What is something that's actually going to be improved? For the interpreter, for the people that they serve. And can we still make it our own? Which I feel like she really did. I think that having staff being in a hub, being in a call center that's their own is kind of making it their own. And that really good example of Anita Diabati Coelho, who was, as Vanessa mentioned, is one of the pioneers, was one of the brave people, because it was a volunteer thing in the beginning, right? So there were, I'm sure, many interpreters who didn't want to do it as well. And if I had been working for them at the time, because I worked for Cambridge Health Alliance for a couple of years, I probably would have been like, no way. So Anita, and I worked with Anita. She was very brave. And I think, again, I think a lot of interpreters probably didn't want to do it, and she did it. And then, she's been developing it ever since and is now training interpreters. And that model, I think, is spreading, that along with that network, which I think is a really neat idea as well, so that more and more hospitals can do it. And yet, you have, it's taking the good part of having a larger company handle it, right? Because of the variety of languages and schedules, and using it to the benefit.
I just have to correct the record because Vanessa is helping me. I had two different things in my notes as well. But just for the record, it was 2007 when that even further back when this transition started. And then what I had said in 2012 was when they, as part of HCIN.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But your reflections, Elena, I mean, I just sit here thinking, and I know it's not just interpreters, these are entire systems. We don't work in silos. We work with people and other entities and parties. But, it's kind of like, wouldn't it have been nice if more of our, court institutions, or even the institutions where conference interpreters work, had been a little less feet draggy, right? With a little more foresight, because certainly I think it's tangible and it's easy when an emergency hits for the healthcare field to be like, well, patients still need healthcare. And if you work, your way out into the other settings, it seems a little more ethereal when we're talking about, well, if the European Parliament is shut down in certain ways for a certain amount of time, well, this isn't the end of the world. We can just kind of. But I think that the work done at those instances also has concrete impacts on individual lives, things going on there impact, maybe NGOs that are working within under those decision makers. Maybe they don't get their budget. Maybe they can't move forward. And all of a sudden, John doesn't have the food that he normally receives. And so it just is helping me really think about the concreteness of the people that are served and are accessed with our services.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting when you think about it as a larger system and access in any field. It's not just for public services, because it matters. I mean, what if it didn't matter to have that communication be multilingual? Then they wouldn't be doing it in the first place. I mean, professional interpreting is not cheap. So if they're doing it and they're paying for it, then it matters to them. And that's being very crass about it. But at the same time, it's true. And the related tangent, I'm an real expert in related tangent. The related tangent on that is that I do think that at the business level, for business interpreting or conference interpreting, there has been an increase in the use of multilingual meetings, and actually access has increased because people that used to not think about it are now thinking about it. Both because part of it might just because it seems easier, and I think it is less expensive because hiring. Even when you hire when you use the right platform or the best platform for interpreters and for your audience, which has a much more of a cost, for example, than using it in Zoom. When you hire professional interpreters, it probably still works out to be less than having to hire everyone on site, to run a business meeting or a large conference on site. So it becomes something that's more accessible in that way. And I think more people are using it. They're that's my impression. I think we're seeing it. I've had a couple new clients that I don't think they had ever really done it before, and we're just kind of getting by in different creative ways. So, and that's what we had been talking about when we first wanted to go into RSI. So it's the top of the hour. Yep. Go ahead, Laura.
I just want to give a shout out to all our healthcare remote interpreters, like these vendor services. And I feel like telephonic or VRI interpreters, sometimes they get a bad rep, like they can't provide the same quality as on-site interpreters or staff interpreters, or that they were unqualified from the beginning, they don't have adequate training. Certainly everyone in the healthcare field needs increased access to training, and access in all of the ways I mean access. But I feel like even very well-trained, highly trained, experienced interpreter working in a VRI or an OPI modality starts already on their heels. Like they're already starting at a disadvantage. It's just very difficult to provide high quality services in those modalities, which is what, when I first I attended a conference and was actually able, and now everything's coming back together, to do a tour of Cambridge and hear about the model and see firsthand the model that they were implementing. And it really, at that moment, was just a light bulb moment, like this is how it needs to be done. Because beyond the navigational, I mean, just in terms of like plain language accuracy, if you're from the area, familiar with the institution, the institutional system within, cardiology is on the fourth floor. That doctor's name, that street name. It's really going to boost the quality of the interpretation that you're able, and your prediction abilities is really what it comes down to in training terms. And so I'd love to see, and of course we need all different types of services out there that's the whole point of everything we're saying regarding remote, is that we need different delivery modalities and nuances of that within the delivery modalities. But it would be great if, and I'm sure maybe someone is going to be like, you don't know what you're talking about. And I might not. But it would be wonderful to know if or why not it would not be feasible for more OPI and VRI companies to rein in, to create somehow that targetedness that exists in this staff model. Can we better pair interpreters with remote assignments so that they're not flipping from a jail in Arizona to a utility bill office in northern Michigan? Can we better help interpreters specialize so that we can, and I'm sure artificial intelligence nowadays could actually help us along.
Yeah, I was just going to say that with artificial intelligence, those are the things that make it quite useful, quite good. They really like kind of localizing, using that word in a different way, but localizing the services that they're giving. That could be very interesting. And of course, it's going to depend on the language too. One of the interviews that I have that's going to be launched very soon, probably not the next one though, because it's also on healthcare, is an interview with a Nepali interpreter who made the transition on her own from working freelance face-to-face to working freelance remote, doing video and phone. And so she and for her it's very different because she's a Nepali interpreter. So the work isn't nearly as voluminous as Spanish, for example, which is another thing that we all, even I, who am not a Spanish interpreter, but my experience in Massachusetts is with Portuguese, which is very similar. We're very narrow-minded in that. So I think even when I talk about diversity, it's also linguistic diversity in that, and the different, what it looks like, depending on your language and your reality. And so for her, it opened up just beautiful stories of what she got to do as an interpreter, and be in these beautiful and painful moments of people's lives, and connect with them as an interpreter remotely, and be able to bring that kind of access to them.
Can I sum up?
Yes.
Sum up just kind of my whole takeaway from this interview with Vanessa, which is, if changing the way that I work can take an LEP patient's triage to room wait time from 20 minutes to 5 minutes, I want to be a part of that. Even if it means having to change my ways, even if it means, learning new ways of working, or actually my job becoming slightly harder in certain ways.
Yeah, that's
so thank
great.
You,
that's
Vanessa,
a really good reminder, because if not, what's happening is that the providers are using Google Translate because that's a quick thing, and they love it. Okay, so I see. Yeah, the Nepali interpreter is local to Boston. She lives in metropolitan Boston. Ooh, I'll have to tell her. Bindya is her name.
I'll respond to her on Facebook, Elena. Can I give one final thought?
Yes, of course.
Something as I was listening to the interview, I, was taking notes, and there was something that Vanessa said, kind of wrapping up the kind of a lot of the nuances of what makes remote interpreting work. And she said there's a value in belonging. And I think that thinking about that, and how do we make patients feel like they belong in this system? How do we make sure that interpreters feel like they belong? I know as an interpreter, I've been in some spaces where I have not felt like I belong. How do we make sure that healthcare providers feel like this, they have skin in the game, and they, how do we make that happen? So that was my final thought. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have connection, relationships, and belonging. Those are, great themes to think about. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been great to see you again, my sisters. And thank you for joining us. And when I say everyone, thank you for joining us on Facebook as well. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Every episode we have a debriefing. We're going to get better at pre-announcing them, pre-scheduling them, posting them in different places, and we're always open to feedback about how you want to see that happen, and participation, and of course recommendations for someone to be interviewee, the next interviewee. So unless you have anything else to say, I'll say goodbye on my end, and see you soon.